you. Well, welcome back. I hope you had a good break, and if you're just joining us, thank you for tuning in to our very important discussion today on post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury. And in the larger scope, we are talking about restoring the warrior's soul, restoring the warrior's ethos, and working together to heal the force. We are in our second session of our four-session day, and now we are so we've laid a basis for understanding warfare, warriorhood as a spiritual arena, and understanding the universal spiritual and moral dimensions that occur, and the importance of the chaplaincy in tending these dimensions. We move on to explore the theory and practice of helping veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury. And as you can see, I call these our sacred wounds. PTSD and moral injury are sacred wounds because our warriors have taken them in the sacred arena and in sacred service to all of us. So we are going to consider what happens to the soul during warfare. And I'm not going to present, there are many good practitioners and psychologists and social workers who are doing all kinds of both conventional and alternative therapies with full heart and full mind and bringing the best they can to the treatment program. Also, there are many different strategies, schools of psychology, techniques for addressing trauma. I am not going to be talking about any of those during this hour as we talk about how to help veterans. But again, I am working to provide a holistic vision that includes you chaplains, psychologists, social workers, behavioral health specialists, everyone in a comprehensive vision of understanding the psyche, the soul's experience in military service and during warfare, and how to nurture it through that experience. We now use the word trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, commonly. And trauma has become a commonly used word around the world. I travel overseas and work with warriors and veterans in other countries as well. And the word trauma comes from the ancient Greek. It's a direct transliteration. Trauma in ancient Greek meant a stabbing wound. Well, I've seen the word trauma spelled out in English in many different languages around the world when we're reading some directive, a health directive in their language, and then suddenly we see this word. Trauma and stress are becoming universal words used around the world. Now, in ancient Greece, the word trauma was a stabbing wound, so if a person was wounded with an arrow or a spear, they were said to be traumatized. But the ancients and traditional cultures did not separate the soul, the spirit, from the body. They did not practice these divisions that we have today. So the ancients understood that when a person was penetrated by the violence of the world in any form, they were traumatized. So whether it's a sexual assault, horrible name-calling and shaming in public, or being stabbed with a knife, these are all traumatizing experiences. And so we have to understand the universal meaning of trauma and its ubiquitous presence in our human experience. You see a statue here also from ancient Greece from 300 BC, and it is called the Wounded Warrior. I take veterans, warriors, their family members, survivors on healing pilgrimages both to Greece and to Vietnam. And when we are in Greece, we visit this statue and we stand in front of it. And I can tell you with an open and broken heart that when our warriors stand in front of this statue, they say, "That's me. That's how I feel inside. This is moral injury. This is PTSD frozen in marble." So look closely. The warrior's body is intact except he's broken across the chest. He's got a broken heart. He's still, even though his legs have been cut out from under him, he's still striving to stand, to defend himself, to defend his people, to complete his mission, to live through the horror. And look at his head, his skull, his face is bashed in, his mind has been disordered and rearranged. And so we see body, mind, heart, and spirit in its wounded condition in this warrior statue. And our veterans and warriors recognize this in themselves and themselves in this. And you see we have some quotes, classical quotes. "Rescue my soul from the sword," King David cried in Psalm 22. Or Othello's warrior returned, more warrior, who also broke down, and we can study Shakespeare to understand PTSD and moral injury as well. Othello, after his crime against his loved ones, cried, it is the cause, my soul." It came from his soul. That combat veteran Art, who broke through in my consciousness, the first man I worked with who talked about his soul loss at the Battle of Quezon, he said, "There and then my soul fled." And our work through therapy was to try to bring his soul back into his body. It didn't leave completely because he was still alive, but he described how tenuously it was connected and how he felt it lived out of him. This is what psychologists call dissociation, but what traditional healers call soul loss. And so this is another clue to how we can work together. We must learn each other's language and be able to realize that we are speaking about the same or similar phenomena, but in different terminology. Well, I would like to turn for a moment to some witnesses from the Air Force. Not only did this machine gunner Art from Quezon talk about his soul loss, but I'll tell you briefly about an Air Force colonel I worked with who was a lifer. During Vietnam, he was in charge of a reconnaissance squadron of aircraft that flew over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and observed and photographed enemy troop movements below, then called them in for our bombers to come and answer. And this colonel described how he would fly over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, call in the orders, watch the bombers strike, and the terrible, terrible conflict he felt and paradox he saw when he was from above looking over the extraordinarily beautiful Vietnamese countryside, the mountains, the valleys, the rivers. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous country. And then he would see the bombers strike, and then he would see the smoke rising out of the jungle and obscuring the sunset, and he was heartbroken and asked himself, up there in his plane, I know I'm doing what I have to do to protect our troops and to serve our nation, and yet, look what I'm doing, helping to destroy all this extraordinary beauty and the human and animal life and plant life below. So he did not have PTSD. He had a moral injury. And he did return to Vietnam with me on one of our return healing journeys, and bless this colonel. Our combat troops who had been on the ground knew where their old AOs were, and we could go there, and they said, this is where I belong, this is where my soul struggled, and we could do healing work and ceremony for them right on those sites. But our colonel said, there's no place for me here, I can't find where I belong, until we came to a remote cemetery, the Trong Son Cemetery, deep in the old demilitarized zone in the jungle. There are over 100,000 graves in that one cemetery of people who had walked the Ho Chi Minh Trail and died on it. Well, our colonel said, this is my home. This is where I belong. This is my ground, because I directed the bombs that fell on these people. And these are my brothers and sisters in death. We're united forever because the war joined us. And I feel like I finally came home. And then he went off to pray over the graves on his own and seek forgiveness and absolution and a spiritual connection with the dead of all sides. Another statement of moral injury that I would like to share with you from the Air Force. This is a young Air Force veteran I work with now. He's about 40. He became chief of the United States Nuclear Detonation Detection System. He was responsible for, in part, for the operational readiness and capacity of our ground survivable mobile units. Well, I'd like to read a statement that he wrote for you today. He wanted to testify here before you about moral injury and soul wounds. So he said, as a young man when I graduated from the Air Force Academy, I was value-driven and filled with a sense of honor and integrity. I had a highly developed sense of social morality. I had firmness of character built solidly on my religious childhood foundation. I had exemplified extreme loyalty to what is right, good, and noble. And I had a desire to serve and protect my country like my father and grandfather had. That's how he went in. Then he was in our ground mobile nuclear units, and he realized he was working, well, I'll just read you his words. I remember sitting in one of those mobile units during our testing, looking around and contemplating what my efforts contributed to. I realized in that agonizing moment I was participating in the plans to destroy and annihilate humankind from the face of the earth. I saw images of nuclear bombs going off. I saw people using this machine I and my team had made, and it made me nauseous. I remember a big knot in my stomach and thoughts consuming my mind. In the core of my being, I felt as if my soul had been pierced through, a knot formed, and I thought to myself as I looked around in terror and rage, this is not what I signed up for. I want to preserve, protect, and defend our nation, not participate in planning for the destruction and annihilation of mankind. In this pivotal moment, I lost my innocence. I received a deep moral, psychological, and spiritual wound. I could no longer see myself as a good and honorable man. And there was nothing I could do to change what I believed at this time was the inevitable outcome of my work. I felt I was participating in an extraordinary evil, and no one wanted to talk about it, acknowledge it, or even face it. He goes on with the profound moral and spiritual damage that he experienced, and this, along with many other testimonies that I've witnessed, that all of you have heard, is testimony of the moral wound and how the moral wound can be at the core. Now, this officer did experience what we call PTSD. He had the same symptomatology: criminal behavior, drug and alcohol abuse, acting out, sexual acting out, insensitivity to relationships, nightmares, flashbacks. He had them all, and we have to realize that what we call PTSD and moral injury both manifest with the same symptomatology. And so we will ask together if they are aspects of the same wound, or, on the other hand, we'll also look carefully at their differences. But please let us know, and both of these Air Force veterans witness, that moral wounding as a result of service from the air or potential service, what our weapons might do if we use them, is it at the core of the moral wound and can haunt us for life. So I'm not going to go over this in detail. I'm just reminding us the medical psychological approach to post-traumatic stress disorder gives us the symptom categories, teaches us what symptoms to look for, teaches us that PTSD can be terrifying, disrupt life, make it hard to get through the day, and the symptoms can manifest anytime, during service, months after, years after, even decades after. And they often don't manifest until retirement, when the veteran stops being busy and his past life has space to return to him. And I've worked with World War II veterans who in their 80s and 90s have applied for disability ratings for the first time, realizing their entire lives were reshaped by the war experience. So, of course, we have this wound we call PTSD that has been known since ancient times. And this information, of course, is readily available, and we've all been educated in it. So we remember PTSD, and we move on to explore how it manifests. Okay, so when we think of post-traumatic stress disorder and our common treatment modalities and our dominant psychological theories and approaches to it, we see that there are two paths home. And the common path is a person enters the military from the civilian world, learns and develops a military identity, behavior, practices, serves in the military, becomes a veteran, and then we expect our veterans to become mostly civilians again, with their veteran identity coming out if they are in some kind of veteran community, VFW, American Legion, Vietnam Veterans of America, Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, many veteran organizations where they can maintain and discuss their veteran identity. But mostly we expect the veterans to become and act like civilians again. And I want to suggest that this growth trajectory, while we want people to come home and rejoin us, is an inevitable recipe for what we call PTSD. Inevitably, because when we try and struggle to become civilians again and take that enlarged and cosmic warrior identity and squeeze it down into the civilian life, it's very hard to make it work. And we know how many people re-up for another deployment to rejoin the military, where they know who they are, what's expected of them, and they feel their identity fits. This goes back, the story is told in mythology as well. If you remember, Achilles in the Trojan War, the fiercest of the Greek warriors, was given the choice. You don't have to go to war and you can live a long life, but you won't be honored and you won't be remembered. You'll be peaceful and happy, have a family, and live to be to old age. Or you can go to war with your comrades and you will die young, but you will have an honorable life and you will be remembered with honor and dignity and nobility. And Achilles, of course, chose to go to war and to fall rather than to live an anonymous and rather mundane, long, ordinary life. And let us be aware that many of our warriors choose that path. They make the choice of Achilles, and we have to help them find meaning and service as warriors afterwards in civilian life. William James, the philosopher and psychologist, said, we have to make the pursuit of peace as exciting, as adrenaline rushing, as intense as the pursuit of war, or humanity will continue to choose war for that great adventure. Well, in contrast to that growth trajectory, we can think of post-traumatic growth and spiritual development. And here we have another PTSD, post-traumatic spiritual development. Traditional societies around the world from ancient times to the present have used this growth trajectory. After someone has served and becomes a veteran, they don't become an ordinary civilian again, though they participate in civilian life, but rather they are recognized as spiritual warriors and elders who are needed by the people, needed by the nation, needed in our danger places, needed to take care of the youth, needed to witness to us to the truth and the realities of military service, not to scare people, certainly not to entertain them, but to prepare us all in case of the terrible eventuality that we have to go back to war. And cultures that have told the truth to their children and to their citizenry and used spiritual warriors to do so, and used elder and spiritual warriors for other positive roles in their society, have been healthier cultures with less violence domestically. And we are a troubled culture with many, many, many challenging places, and we need our elder warriors there. They could serve there in ways that most of us couldn't. We need the elder warriors in the prison system. Many serve as first responders on the police departments, fire departments, EMT squads. That is continuous with their spiritual warriorhood. We need conservation corps of warriors. We need them in the inner cities. We need them in our troubled schools. So there are places for elder warriors in the challenged conditions of our society. And warriors have always served in such places. And we would do well to nurture them to be able to serve in these places, in our society. So, we recognize, again, we call the wound, the comprehensive and holistic wound was renamed PTSD in 1980. Only after Vietnam veterans, Holocaust survivors, and women survivors of domestic violence and sexual trauma said, look at us, we're all manifesting the same symptoms. What happened to all of us that we all have this kind of wound? Finally, in 1980, PTSD was named as a modern diagnosis. And last year, in 2014, with a new Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the D is dropped sometimes, so it's post-traumatic stress. In Canada and in some of our branches, it's called operational stress disorder. They're all complicated names that don't deeply name the condition in ways that are familiar. Here we have some of the other names that have occurred over the ages. We know of more than 80 names since ancient times that the holistic invisible war wound has been called. Most of those names indicate pain, exhaustion, loss, collapse, spiritual emptiness. Look, the Spanish called it to be broken in the 1600s. The Swiss and the German and French talked about homesickness, and they meant the longing of the soul to be able to come home, not just the body to get out of the war zone. It was called soldier's heart in the Civil War, and doctors at that time really looked for all of the physiological changes in the heart, as today our medical establishment looks for the changes in the brain. But they also, and that was Dr. DaCosta in Philadelphia, in the Union Army and then the Philadelphia War, who first named this condition in his times, in his modern times. That was also a breakthrough. So it was called DaCosta's syndrome when they concentrated on the physical dimensions, soldier's heart when they concentrated on the emotional, psychological dimensions. But both physiologically and psychologically, the heart is affected. So we recognize that this condition has existed since ancient times, and we have given it more and more medical scientific names. And our warriors would often prefer soldier's heart. I have a soldier's heart. I carry a soldier's heart. I know what that means. And of course, we could say airman's heart as well. We mean soldier in the universal sense of a warrior. This is a book from the end of World War I, 1919. You see, it was called Soldier's Heart and the Effort Syndrome, and it does list many of the symptoms of breathlessness, anxiety, stress, pain, exhaustion that troops experienced then, that we still experience now, and that we consider part of the PTSD package. Notably, it was also called the effort syndrome, and in psychology today we talk about motivation and its loss. From Civil War to World War I, they talked about effort and the inability of a war survivor to make effort. In philosophical and theological terms, we usually refer to the will. Will, effort, motivation, it's the same. But Plato and others have observed the will is an act of the soul. It comes from the soul. And when we often look at our survivors, they look like they're intact and could perform. It's as if the car is all there, but the starter engine won't turn on. This is the effort syndrome. And we often connect it with depression, loss of will, loss of the ability to propel ourselves from within. Very important that we recognize that this too has historically been part of the war wound. After service in combat, it may feel exceedingly difficult and almost hopeless to make effort to do anything worthwhile again. So again, we're looking at the universal dimensions and what needs to be behind all of our therapeutic efforts. Both clinicians and chaplains need to be thinking this way in whatever school of healing you practice. So we recall that initiation has always been part of the warrior's journey, and that we have used becoming warriors to initiate young people into adulthood. The essential dimensions of initiation are simple to understand. It is a death and dismemberment of the old self, passing through ordeal into rebirth and reconfiguration, rememberment of a new self and a new identity. Now, the initiation process has been It happens on all important life events. Birth is an initiation into this world. The movement from a person through puberty into adulthood is an initiation into an adult and a sexual identity. Warriorhood has always been used as an initiation to teach people the key lessons of life. How fragile life is, how precious life is, how it must be protected, how we are really always living on a knife edge of life and death, and we must do our best to serve life. And coming through that learning, we are reborn into elders, into adults who are not looking for self-satisfaction as an immature psyche does, but are looking to serve the common good in meaningful ways. So initiation is at the essence of warriorhood, and we are seeking to complete the initiations of our warriors who may have been wounded and feel that their initiation is incomplete as they passed through the demands of service and combat. Another growth circle diagram. I hope many of you are familiar with Joseph Campbell's work. He wrote many fine books. He was the premier mythologist of America of the 20th century. And many of his books, we have the Hero with 1,000 Faces, we have his world study of the Masks of God, 4 volumes covering the mythology of the entire planet. Now, Campbell suggested that we all live a monomyth. We are on a hero's journey. And all of our sacred stories from the world mythological and spiritual traditions fit into the stages of departure, initiation, and return from the hero's journey. This too is the warrior's journey, and we will see how the warrior departs the mainstream, is initiated in the challenges of the underworld, and then returns to our society. When we expand the hero's journey a bit, we realize there is that departure from the underworld. There is a descent into darkness and an encounter with the dark and difficult forces of life. At the very bottom, there is what many veterans will call meeting the beast, or having the mad moment, or going berserk. They're all the same. We do have a savage beast inside us. Beauty and the Beast is one of our true fairy tales. We have a beast, it can emerge, it can take over. We need the kiss of beauty to soothe that savage beast eventually. And we'll talk about how to deliver that. But we meet the beast. Some people give into it and are possessed by the beast in the combat zone. Some are able to resist the beast and keep their minds clear and their hearts strong and not have that mad moment and yet still function well in the combat zone. So, did you meet the beast or not? And what did it do? And did it take you over? And is that beast still part of your personality? And how can we befriend the beast becomes critical in the healing journey, again, no matter what strategies or techniques we use. After meeting the beast, we have to have mastery of these dark forces and initiation as warriors. We have to integrate and initiate ourselves. Carl Jung points out in his study of dreams that as long as we are seeing the same event, when we have nightmares or flashbacks and we see the same combat event, we still see that tank coming at us, we haven't completed our initiation, we haven't integrated the experience. But rather, when we begin to symbolize, the psyche is digesting the symbols through images and able to carry it in a contained and symbolized fashion, then we are attaining mastery. So if the tank becomes a dragon, or a truck barreling down the road, or any other version that makes it more universal and more symbolic, we are achieving some integration, and we need to look for that and nurture that, not just squash the imagery that's trying to raise up, but our minds are our stream of images, and we need to change and recreate the images so we can carry the experience. Finally, the return, and Joseph Campbell points out that on the hero's journey, the return journey may be the most difficult part, because when we're in the underworld, we're with our battle buddies, we know what we have to go through, as difficult as it is. But when we return, we've changed, but our loved ones haven't changed, society hasn't changed, Society wants us to be civilians again. Our loved ones want the same husband or wife or son or daughter they sent into the military and overseas. And they've changed as well from the separation. They don't know how we've changed, and they may not understand what we've been through. So return can be exceedingly difficult. So when we take all of these circle diagrams, oh, by the way, all of these are in my new book, Warrior's Return, and I'm going through this rather quickly because our time is limited, but I go through all these dimensions very slowly, fully, deeply, with many examples from warrior and veteran lives to help you understand and utilize this in your own ministry and therapeutic approaches. And so now we overlay all of these circle diagrams of psycho-spiritual growth through the life cycle that have come to us from many disciplines, and we overlay this on the warrior's journey, and look what we have. I call this the soldier's heart transformational model. And if we trace it from 1 o'clock, from the old self, all the way around the circle of growth and transformation, we can and must include all of the warrior's experiences. Who was the old self? How did you answer the call? How did you take leave? What happened in boot camp and advanced training? Where were you assigned? Did you get the assignment you wanted or you enlisted for? Were you deployed where? When did you arrive in the war zone? What emotions did you have? Did you meet that beast or did you not? Were you able to resist it? How were you able to behave in the war zone? What degree of brotherhood and sisterhood did you experience? Did you experience mastery over the beast? How were you transformed? What was your leave taking like? What was your homecoming like with all of the culture shock, the grief, the loss, the pain, the displacement, feeling like you can't fit in? And what are the higher functions? How are we making meaning and seeking spirituality now? What has been our experience of being restored in the community? What finally is the warrior's vision, like St. Francis, like the unknown soldier? What is that redemptive warrior's vision that we carry? I wish we had time today to go over every step slowly, but you can and you must with your charges, with your warriors. Both behavioral health people and chaplains can go over every step on the warrior's journey and see what happened, what was blessed and developed, and what was wounded along the way, and pause deeply and tend to any wounding that happened in any step of this holistic journey. And when we do the complete circle, we get there. We get there. We get to whole, healed warriors who can carry their experiences and have a high vision without collapse, but with lifelong service. Now, we're not only talking about the psychological and the soul wounding. So remember, we have PTSD as post-traumatic soul distress, but we also have PTSD as post-traumatic social disorder. There is a social contract between warriors and civilians, and it is critical to recognize it. I have the buffalo up because our Plains Native Americans took their model of how to live well and how to relate to warriors from the buffalo. They observed that when buffalo were peaceful and just grazing, they were scattered on the plains in random fashion. But when they were threatened, they immediately and spontaneously gathered in concentric circles of protection. The buffalo pushed the cows and the calves, the women and children, into the center. The cows pushed the calves into the very center. The cows ran a protective circle around them. Then the bulls circled the cows and the calves, the warriors protecting the women and children. And the old bulls pushed the younger bulls into an inner circle. It wasn't the young bulls who were fertile and gave life, but were immature and perhaps not ready to meet the threat. They were also protected by the old bulls who ran in the circle around them. So there were 4 concentric circles protecting each other, running as a united people against the threat. So the Plains people modeled their warrior beliefs around this, and they also taught that after the threat has passed, just like the buffaloes, if a buffalo was wounded in any of the circles, all the other buffaloes would push that wounded buffalo into the center so the entire herd could try to carry them along and protect them. When the warriors returned, the circles reversed, and in traditional cultures, the civilians surrounded the warriors. In responsible response, it was our responsibility to now preserve, intend, and protect you because you put your life on the line to protect and defend me. You warriors, perform these circles of protection for us all the way around the globe today. All the way around the globe. And we civilians, in large part, have failed to tend and serve and protect you. We leave it to the government institutions, which are overwhelmed with the numbers of cases and are not able to answer to all of the needs of our veterans, and too many civilians just pass the buck and don't serve in that protective outer ring. So in order to heal our warriors, we do need veteran-civilian unity. We do need to wake up the populace to all that they can do for our warriors. And what I find is not that they don't want to, but that they're frightened of warriors and the war experience, but mostly they're not very frightened, but rather they don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. We haven't trained our civilians to take care of our warriors either. And so we are remiss in practicing the proper social contract with our warriors. And we need to restore our democracy and restore civilian responsibility and proper relations between our warriors and civilians. So, with this understanding, we ask, what, in a holistic sense, is this comprehensive war wound that we call PTSD? Well, of course, we affirm that there have been changes to the brain chemistry and nervous system, and we need to do work there. But we also affirm it is a heart wound. The heart is broken. Warriors have broken hearts. It's a moral wound, what we call moral injury now, but our sense of right and wrong, of good and evil has been transformed forever, and we feel responsible and have participated in the wounding. It is a social disorder, as we've just described, because everybody isn't involved, everybody isn't united, and there are broken relations between warriors and civilians. And very many of our warriors say they were able to function well in the war zone, but their trauma happened upon homecoming, from neglect, from betrayal, from inadequate or unavailable treatment, from coldness from the society. Even it's not like after Vietnam, and we apologize to all of our Vietnam veterans for the terrible betrayal and lack of support and judgment that you experienced. Beyond that, when we aren't there, not just to welcome troops home, but to give them everything they need of rest and downtime and love and beauty and tending, we have a social disorder. The wound is also interrupted initiation. We said there is a death and dismemberment that happens as we pass through our trials, and then a rebirth and rememberment. Well, what we call PTSD is an interrupted initiation. People are stuck in that transition. They've had the death and dismemberment. They haven't experienced rebirth and rememberment. And chaplains and behavioral health people all are responsible, as medicine chiefs of warriors were, to complete, and the people are, to complete the interrupted initiation that has not been completed in our version of military service. And the wound is also frozen war zone consciousness. We call it battle mind. When a person can't get out of battle mind, when they're still seeing and feeling and operating as if they're in the war zone, even though their bodies have come home, we have a frozen consciousness that manifests in this holistic wound. We've explored how it is an identity crisis. I am different now. Can I recreate an identity that works? And can society recognize me with an identity that works? Quick story, as I was a keynote speaker at one of our colleges, the convener of the college conference on veterans in college came running up to me in civilian dress, but he had his CIB pin on his lapel, his Combat Infantryman's badge. He just, before he even said hello, and we hadn't met before, he looked at me and said, "Is it all right if I wear this today?" I just said to him, "Brother, You're wearing your eagle feather. Of course, it's more than all right. It's good. Show people who you are and what you've done. Well, he wore it. It was the first time he had worn it since Vietnam. He explained to people in our opening remarks what it was. He's worn it ever since, and he has now founded a nonprofit in the Philadelphia area for helping our younger veterans. So he publicly affirmed his old warrior identity, and he walks with it. He dresses as a civilian. He operates quite well, but he has his CIB, so people know, as they did in the Native American community, that I'm wearing my eagle feather. I'm a different person carrying a different identity. So, back to the wound. It is also a love and intimacy crisis. The way we relate, the way we love, the way we connect, the way we practice our sexuality changes forever. And it can be more, it can be less, it can be open, it can be closed. There are many, many different stories, but we do have to talk about how you love and how you practice your sexuality now, and how is this related to the experiences you've had. And let us also add, it's about parenting as well. And many veterans choose never to have children because they don't want to pass on the wound, or they are so in despair about what has happened to our world that they don't bring children into it. So we need to examine that too. Some veterans I've taken back to Vietnam on our annual healing journeys say they've never touched a child, they've never hugged a child since Vietnam service. But in Vietnam, the children are beautiful and loving, and there's no judgment. They crawl all over our vets, and eventually they open their arms and they hug children again. And the joy that floods back in their heart when they can affirm the ongoing, beautiful, loving nature of life is extraordinary. The wound is also stuck in the underworld. As we said, we've made a descent into hell, but we haven't come back yet. And so we need to, again, with whatever therapeutic techniques we use, foster that return from the underworld and awareness of where we've been and realization of how difficult that return journey is, and public acknowledgement and understanding of it so that they can embrace us as transformed people. And finally, we say it is the soul's cry of distress, post-traumatic soul distress. So, when we call it PTSD, we have post-traumatic soul distress and post-traumatic social disorder, both. We are out of sync with our own psyches. Remember, all of us, psyche meant soul in ancient Greek. That's the meaning of the word, and only in more modern times did we translate it into mind. Soul includes everything we are, including our mentation. So we have soul distress, we have social disorder, and these necessitate post-traumatic spiritual development. It is a necessity, and in fact, some of us who are practitioners in this field say that in fact it is impossible to return without being on some kind of spiritual path. And again, we affirm you can be a humanist, you can be an atheist, you don't need to believe in the deity to be on a profoundly meaningful, humanistic, spiritual, and moral journey, trying to make the best out of our human condition, using our human means to do it together. So, again, theory and practice of bringing our veterans home. These are the necessities of return as I have gathered them and abstracted them from all world warrior traditions. And it's important that we go through each step because each step has been proven to be necessary in a return of the warrior from the battle zone. Some of these steps are in the Bible, and we'll study that in our third session together. Some of these steps come from other traditions. The picture you see is of two of our Native American warriors. Our Native Americans still give our American military, in proportion to their numbers in the population, They are the largest ethnic representation in our military because they come from the warrior tradition and they are seeking to fulfill that warrior tradition. These two Vietnam veterans both had PTSD and moral trauma earlier, but you see them now. They're happy, they're healthy. They've been to our Soldiers' Heart retreats. We went back to Vietnam together, and they are beaming people who have returned to their reservation. They are on the Flathead Reservation in Montana. Will on my left, who's just in the t-shirt, has become a war dance chief for his people, and Roger, facing me on the right, who is in, is wearing his Marine medallion over his Native American t-shirt. So you see he's put the two warrior traditions as one, and these are beautiful souls, and they both are returning their traditional warrior practices to their young veterans on their reservation and to all people of all ethnic groups. So we thank and honor them and our Native Americans for carrying the warrior tradition, and we review the necessities of return from all indigenous traditions on the planet. The first step is isolation and tending. Now, many of our veterans will isolate spontaneously when they come home. We know how people hide out in the wilderness, in ramshackle motel rooms, in their parents' basement. They are isolating because we haven't given them isolation time. Isolation and tending is necessary. And in traditional cultures, people were isolated first upon return from battle before going home. So Moses said in Deuteronomy, he ordered a week of isolation and purification for every returning Israelite warrior before they returned to their families and their villages. And he also ordered purification of the weapons in fire and of the person and all the clothing and equipment in water several times during that week. Purification is necessary. Isolation and tending comes first, and we can think of this as prescribing an acute period of PTSD. If we allow a short acute period and give the troops everything they need upon return, it will not necessarily go chronic. Tend people upon, and we're also always worried about the bottom line, the budget. We would save millions and millions of dollars by allowing people to have their collapse and tending time and we would save that money in the long-term health care if we tended people correctly upon return. After isolation and tending, we have affirmation of warrior destiny. Much of what we call the traumatic wound is the heart and soul screaming, no, no, I did not like this, I did not want this, I hate what I had to do, I hate what happened to me. Sometimes it's too much yes, 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 I want more, I want to go back, I want to kill the bad guys. In traditional cultures, we did not look for the no or the yes. We looked for the calm, centered, yes, I choose to be a warrior in our people's service, and yes, I accept the many hardships of the journey. We seek that affirmation of warrior destiny, and again, chaplains and behavioral health people can all look for and work for that deep, centered yes. Purification and cleansing is critical. And again, it wasn't just Moses that ordered it. Of course, our Native American traditions give us the Vision Quest and the Sweat Lodge and other purification practices. African warrior traditions used to bury warriors up to their necks in the earth so the poisons could leach out into the earth. Air has been used also for sacred elements, earth, air, fire, and water. In Austria, they reconciled with their collaboration with the Nazis during the Holocaust. In order to, 80,000 Austrian children wrote letters to Holocaust victims from the Austrian experience and attached them to helium balloons and sent them up into the heavens as a national reconciliation process. So there are many, many forms of purification and cleansing. And of course, our home religions of origin have baptism, confession. The Jewish tradition has the communal confession of Yom Kippur. And the prayer to the divine to forgiveness for the vows that we took and could not keep. So there's many forms of purification and cleansing. All of them any of them can be studied and adapted to the needs of warriors. After purification and cleansing always came storytelling, and in traditional cultures, warriors were not isolated, but rather they told their stories to all people. In Vietnam, we are told that the elder warriors began going into the schools for what we call middle school, 6th, 7th grade, for years. From the French War, from the American War, the elder warriors who returned went in and told the truth to their children so they would know what to expect, because they had been occupied and invaded for almost 2,000 years, and they did expect they would have to serve. And they went off to battle much better prepared, and storytelling by the elders to the youth was one of the many reasons that their people did not develop PTSD. We leave it to Hollywood and the popular media to give us our warrior mythology, but rather we have so many warriors among us. We must listen to them, hear their stories, honor their stories, and make living people our warriors of legend, and carry their stories and spread them to all Americans of all ages, to prepare us all for the tending necessary and for the dangers that might come as our world history unfolds. After storytelling came restitution in the community, and this meant two things. For the warrior, it meant taking a warrior's vow to serve as an elder warrior for the rest of life and to perform good deeds, restorative service. Restitution means to buy back one's soul in the theological sense. And so through doing good works, tending the young, rebuilding the world, our warriors perform restorative service and achieve restitution. In addition, traditional cultures always had restitution practices where the civilians who did not serve surrounded the warriors, and through ceremony, we do this in our Soldiers' Heart healing retreats, and it's always very meaningful and moving. The civilians surround the warriors, and they deliver some kind of message such as this: "You are my warriors. You served in my name for my benefit and protection. I sent you. I paid for the bullets. I elected the officials who sent you. And so I am responsible. We are all responsible. We lift the moral burden you carry off your shoulders. And as your citizen, as your brother or sister, I willingly take the pain that you feel upon myself." You can hear that I'm feeling it right now. I willingly carry your pain as my own, and your story is mine, and I pledge to do everything I can to honor you, to bring you home, to carry this burden with you. When we do that, it lifts the sense of individual brokenness and pathology off the survivor and transfers the responsibility to all of us where it indeed belongs. And so we can stop the individual collapse into PTSD and moral injury by collectively owning that responsibility for what happened, with all of you warriors having been on the front lines for all of us, but we sent you, and the wound and the responsibility for it belongs to us all. And only after that did we have initiation as elder warriors. Elder warriors were those who could carry this well without collapse and without breakdown, and teach and serve the community for the rest of their days. So finally, as we wrap up this session and we call our dear chaplains to the podium for our next panel discussion, I will just summarize a few of the key points in the recovery and therapeutic healing process of this model. We have to know that there is hope and that healing and profound transformation are possible. When we tell our troops, get used to it, all you can do is readjust to your difficult conditions, you will never be better, you will never heal, we throw them back into hell, where liturgy teaches us, abandon hope, all ye who enter here. There must be hope. There must be hope. It's the last thing in Pandora's box, remember. And healing and transformation are indeed possible, especially if we do not pathologize the condition, but realize it is a transformed condition we need to nurture. We do not marginalize our veterans, our survivors, but bring them into the center of our communities as the traditional peoples did. We do not impose our interpretations and tell our vets what they mean, but rather listen deeply with utmost respect to their experiences of military and the combat zone. We do not separate military and civilians, but encourage them to serve each other and create that protective civilian circle of tending and caring around our troops. Many faith communities across the country have created veteran ministries and talking circles right out of their congregations to achieve this. We accept trauma as a portal for transformation and initiation and a source of life wisdom. Bible tells us, get wisdom though it cost all you have. Well, perhaps the traumatic wound is the cost we pay for this difficult wisdom that we have gained. But we are transformed and initiated. We are not broken and cast away. We accept the survivor as our guide to the underworld. I was never in the combat zone. I learned from deep loving and listening to all of our survivors. They were a magnet for me. I wanted to know and I wanted to serve and I wanted to understand. And so you have been my guides. You have been my teachers. I honor you forever for the wisdom you brought back. And let's pass it on to everyone so we are together in this. We accept warriorhood as a lifelong spiritual identity and a lifelong journey, a difficult and demanding journey, but with great blessings and rewards for the individual and especially for the society. The transformation is supposed to benefit us all. The warrior goes off to serve us all, not just to serve him or herself, and returns to serve us all. We seek meaningful forms of creative expression, of corrective experience, of restorative action, and meaningful spiritual practice. All these are necessary. The arts are used. Our new Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, as they return home, are having an artistic renaissance. The amount of poetry, drama, film, visual arts that are coming out of that community is extraordinary. And many of them are saying no to therapy, but yes to art. I want to express, I want to create. This will give me what I need, and this will communicate to the community, because I want to talk to everybody, not just my counselor. So seek these forms of expression. They work. They work. And the warrior traditions of the world have always used, and actually some of them have required, artistic expression. The samurai all practiced the arts. The Celtic warriors said, "No sword without your drum." And so creative expression to balance the killing arts is critical. Also, veteran and spouse and care providers all become battle buddies on the homecoming journey. The warrior, partner, and helpers all walk a moral and spiritual journey together. And we who witness are also transformed. We are also changed and transformed for the better by the exposure. And so together we rebuild identities and we restore the warrior archetype. And ultimately, again, no matter what counseling, therapeutic, or ministerial practices you use, healing is stepping back into the warrior archetype and restoring that warrior archetype in its blessedness, its beauty, and its fullness. And when we do that with any therapeutic approach, it works. Our warriors come home and heal, and then we all heal together. So, thank you for attending our second session, and now I welcome our dear chaplains back up onto the podium with me so we can turn to your questions and concerns.
Dr. Tick, thank you so much for the information that you've presented so far. We really appreciate you being here with us today. One of the questions we received has to do with judgment, so let me just get to this question. When a chaplain uses the term moral injury, a warrior suffering from moral injury may perceive the chaplain as making a moral judgment on the warrior, implicitly stating that the warrior must have committed a moral offense. However, not all moral injury is the result of abrogating moral standards. I like the term soldier's heart. Mm-hmm. Is there a better term than moral injury that chaplains can use? The VA has used terms such as spiritual injury, for example.
Well, yes, there are better terms. First, let's remember that the wounds we call post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury today have been known by many different names throughout history, and as I said earlier, we know more than 80 different names. Secondly, I am troubled myself by the term moral injury for this reason. Warriors take wounds. Of course, people are injured in service, but we tend to think of injury as a passive experience where we are accident victims. Accident victims are injured. Car accident victims are injured. And we also, of course, we have the word illness, and many people mistakenly think that post-traumatic stress disorder or moral injury are forms of mental illness. They aren't. So we do need to find names that work. You're not the only chaplain or warrior who prefers soldier's heart. Many say that and use that. Many do say, my soul has been wounded, my soul was lost, and they want to do soul talk with us, and will respond better when we talk about the soul than when we talk about disorder or a broken psyche. But how is your soul wounded? And the word wound itself restores honor and accuracy to the experience. So I prefer moral wound to moral injury, and there's no negative judgment about being wounded in service. On the contrary, let's remember that in many cultures and traditions, wounds were publicly displayed. They were honored. Native Americans painted their wounds. They painted the wounds on their horses. And what do we call a scar on a horse? Proud flesh. So let us be proud of our wounds, carry them with dignity, think of them as proud flesh, and even the invisible wounds as a proud wound that I took on behalf of my people, our people. And even if I judge myself as having done wrong, I still served. I took a wound that was inevitable in battlefield conditions, and I am striving, and we are striving to help them be proud of that wound. We do that with physical wounds. Be proud of your prosthetic device. Don't hide it from the public. Let's do that with the invisible wounds as well.
The next question has to do with prevention. What are some evidence-based methods or treatments for increasing resiliency that also prevent the damage caused by PTSD and moral injury?
Well, I'm going to argue that evidence-based means that not only that we study it and have statistics supporting it, but that we know the methodologies really heal and transform people. And so when we look at evidence-based, let's also look at what has worked throughout history for our warriors. So some of the evidence-based matters that work are actually what we've considered perhaps basic human truths. Let us express grief and do grief work. Let people have the time and give the attention to express the feelings that are stored in their heart. Let people tell their stories. Many of our modern therapeutic techniques are brief therapy, trying to retrain the brain quickly and actually circumvent storytelling. And many practitioners say, I don't even want to hear your stories. I just want to help you readjust your cognitive functioning such that you don't have the symptomatic breakdown. And many of these techniques really do work and are helpful. Rapid eye movement, desensitization, EFT, many of these techniques really do work, and there is empirical research saying they reduce symptomatology. Veterans tend to say, yeah, they've helped, but they're not complete. And they say, I really need a deep, loving, trusting relationship with the practitioner before I'm going to let you take me through your methodologies. And so evidence-based techniques, we can study them and use them for symptom reduction. They don't go far enough in identity transformation, and rather supporting the grief, giving time to tend. And here's evidence that people need downtime afterwards. We haven't given people enough downtime between deployments. I don't remember exactly when, a few years ago, there was a bill in front of the United States Congress that would guarantee people as much rest time between deployments as time they had been overseas. That bill was defeated, finances again, in the American way. The same bill was before Parliament in Great Britain for their modern warriors. The British passed this bill, and immediately that every single troop who had been deployed would have at least as much, if not more, rest time at home before they could be deployed again. Immediately. They didn't even have to wait a year for people to have rest. But as soon as the troops heard that, the PTSD rates plummeted. Wow. So we know that R&R, in a deep sense, rest and renewal with enough time and attention from the caregivers will genuinely increase resiliency, reduce trauma, help people recover, and if they have to go back, help them be ready and well and prepared to go back in.
Dr. Tick, we can't thank you enough for taking the time and your wisdom and hard-earned expertise in this area. We have one post-vention question from the field that we invite you to turn your attention to for us. And this involves the plasticity of the brain that you mentioned just a few minutes ago. The idea that we can rewire in certain ways, sometimes maybe very quickly, the way the brain processes and works. So the question is this: given the plasticity of the human brain and the research behind that phrase that suggests that the brain can change in as short a time as a couple of months, is it possible for certain treatments to reverse the effects of PTSD and moral injury and bring about a quicker and sustained healing? If so, can you elaborate on any of those techniques?
Well, we do know and affirm that there are many alternative and holistic techniques going on today that have helped our veterans heal. And so we have equine therapy and other animal therapies that help restore a trusting, a fundamental, foundational trusting relationship. We also know, actually, we're studying animal behavior, we also understand the universality of trauma, because what we call PTSD has been diagnosed in bears and wolves and dogs and cats and whales and dolphins and elephants and rhinoceri and other creatures. So we know that when a community and environment are severely invaded and violated, that this breakdown that we call PTSD today will occur in many of the survivors. So we learn that from the animals, and we can also learn to heal, and so traumatized animals and traumatized veterans are working together. It's one form of rewiring the heart. Of course, we have many techniques for retraining the brain, and again, what we're trying to do is recreate neurological pathways so that responses are different. And we have modern techniques for doing that, but there are also ancient techniques. And so some of the radical practices that our indigenous cultures used also retrained the brain, reformulated the way we process information. And so many veterans of all ethnic groups are going to Native American communities saying, conventional counseling isn't working for me. I want to go into the sweat lodge. I want to go on a vision quest. I want to severely challenge and afflict myself in a holistic manner, body, mind, heart, and spirit, such that everything about me gets rewired and retrained. So the short answer is yes, the human brain is plastic. Yes, if we give proper practices, we can retrain the brain. Sometimes we can do it quickly. Scouts Honor, the veterans I take back to Vietnam have suffered with PTSD and moral injury for 35, 40, 45 years. And in 2 or 3 weeks back in Vietnam, through reconciliation practices with the Vietnamese, and this gets into our chaplaincy work and what we can do together, quick healing through the chaplain corps, through exchanging forgiveness, through rehumanizing the other, through accepting the inevitability, through, as the Vietnamese say, they're Buddhist, creating good karma if we feel we've done wrong, through being honored by our former foes as not having done wrong, but being honorable warriors, that lifts the stain. And I've seen people who had suffered for 40 years who come back after 3 weeks together on pilgrimage, on sacred pilgrimage, healed, sleeping like babies, no more nightmares. So we have modern techniques, we have ancient pilgrimage, we have the spiritual practices of indigenous cultures that are all oriented toward, even if they didn't do brain chemistry studies then, they somehow knew that deep, profound, holistic transformation was possible, and they affected it.
Thank you for that.
There's hope.
Indeed. Thank you for bringing some more of that to our attention through your presentations today.
You're welcome.
We've talked a lot about moral injury in relation to combat experience, but there's a pressing and very cogent question that we receive from the field about moral injury from a very different source and how that is sometimes caught up in conflicts. So another question for you. Are you aware of any research about moral injury in relation to sexual assault?
Yes.
Would moral injury resulting from sexual assault be the same, similar, or different from moral injury resulting from combat? And finally, what are the ramifications of moral injury when sexual assault occurs in a combat environment?
Very glad you asked this question and that it came from the field, because we all know that sexual assault is tragically epidemic. And we also have to ask why, because I've done some comparative research. I've spoken with researchers and officers from our military comrades around the world. In Vietnam, I've researched their combat experiences heavily and asked if did sexual abuse and trauma ever happen between your soldiers? And they, of course, had women and men serving side by side during that war. I've spoken with people in the Israeli forces also, where women and men serve as equals. And all sources report that they do not have anywhere near the degree of sexual assault within their military as we do. So we have to ask ourselves very deep and hard questions about why are our forces breaking down in this version of traumatic wounding when most other forces around the world seem to be able to sustain themselves without such horror. Secondly, it's very important to remember that men as well as women are afflicted by this. And the statistics we have are that about a third of our women in service and a quarter of our men in service will experience some kind of sexual harassment or assault while they're in service. So we're very concerned about our women troops, but let's also be concerned about our men troops and the damage that happens to them if they're victimized. And I've worked with many men troops who have been sexually assaulted, and it does terrible damage. So then to the key question that you're asking, what is the result? And is it how is it similar or different in moral injury from the moral injury resulting from combat? The bottom line is it's worse. It's worse. It's a deeper injury because our own battle buddies have done it to us. We need to be absolutely, utterly on each other's side, protecting each other's lives and safety, security, and well-being. And when we are side by side in the combat zone, we need to have the greatest and most inviolate trust possible in each other. When your own comrade, your own chief, your own officer, anybody can do it, practices any form of sexual assault or abuse, that trust is shattered. And so suddenly we're in the combat zone, feel completely unsafe, all alone, not protected by our buddies. Sometimes, tragically, it's often the case that there is not prosecution, not responsibility, not removal of the offender, and sometimes even protection of the offender. So somebody might be on the combat line a day or a week after with the person who assaulted them. Can I trust you with my life if you try to rape me in the latrine last week? That's what we have. And so we have the most profound dimensions of a loss of trust, security, safety, belonging, comradeship, upon which our military brotherhood and sisterhood is utterly dependent. And we lose that in the combat zone, and our survivors feel so extraordinarily alone and unprotected in a dangerous universe that it's hard to give words to what they suffer. And they come home, yes, as you are indicating, with deeper and more comprehensive and difficult moral injury than even combat survivors.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. And so with this panel discussion, thank you both very much, chaplains.
Thank you.
And forgive me for not introducing you. I was supposed to, but we have Chaplain General Chisholm, who's assistant to the Chief of Chaplains of the Air Force, serving in the Pentagon. Thank you, and honored to be with you, Chaplain
Thank you,
General. And we have our dear questing friend and brother, Chaplain Little, and you'll have to fill in your station. I forgot in all of this other business.
Oh, no problem at all.
Service.
I'm the staff chaplain for readiness at the Air National Guard Readiness Center.
Thank you. So bless you, chaplains. Bless you all for joining us. We do have an hour lunch break now, and we begin at what time?
1300, I think. Is that correct?
Okay, thank you. We return at 1300 for 2 more sessions this afternoon. Have a good break. Thank you for... Whoops, 1400? Yes.
That's right, 1400 Eastern Time.
14
Okay,
Eastern.
sorry. 13 to 1400 is lunch. We return and start again at 1400. If you're able, please stick with us, because we have designed today as a long, continuous day with each lesson we share, building on the next one. And whether you can come back or not, thank you, bless you, keep serving, keep tending our beloved troops and all of our wounded. Godspeed. We'll see you at 1400.
Thank you.